I know where the hare sleeps. I know how the moon flies. I have slept in the house of the crows. And I know the name of the hound that lies. All this be known to thee?
Be silent, wicked child!
Behind me here is Pendle Hill. Back in the 1600s, an awful event happened, the Pendle Witch Trials. Being a Lancashire lad, as I am, it's a story that, part of the tradition of Lancashire as well, is passed down through the generations. It's been something that's always been there in the background, and it's very much appropriate even now.
Outside that of the stereotypes and other assumptions made in the popular age, there definitely is a feeling that when one enters Pendle Witch country proper, a change in atmosphere occurs, a heaviness takes root. It's kind of hard to explain, but nevertheless it's there. One get the impression that this is something of a cursed landscape. The start of the year 1612 was notable for the death of Rudolph II, the Holy Roman Emperor, a monarch who used his reign to further the study of the occult sciences, and in particular astrology and alchemy. Within Prague, where Rudolph II ruled his empire, such things as divination and magical arts were considered part and parcel of the mainstream sciences of his time. However, 1,000 miles away among the windswept hills and moorlands of northern England, it was a very different matter altogether, at least on the surface. By the early 1600s, England was already in the grip of a collective hysteria surrounding both witches and Catholics. Papist plotters and cursing hags, considered to be hiding in the shadows and under every bed, were out to torment every Protestant who wasn't constantly vigilant. Collective suspicions, as well as harsh penal enforcements, were often equally applicable to both groups from the increasingly myopic and paranoid official Church of England establishment. Even so, among the present population of the British Isles, as well as within the most marginalised members of society, magic, witchcraft and the occult sciences were central to their impoverished lives. Herbalism, in particular, was considered a kind of folk magic among the poor, who could not afford the services of an able doctor. Therefore, magical herbalism became a highly valued form of witchcrafting, especially in rural regions. Skin disorders in particular plagued the peasant population due to their basic diets of salted meats, fish and limited root vegetables, with the occasional seasonal fruits, which often resulted in jaundice, urinary issues and joint pains. Witches were commonly employed to use herbal remedies in order to alleviate this suffering, which made them a central part of agrarian societies in particular. Yet along with this system of herbal magic, another more pathological form of sorcery existed. Magic which involved the use of curses, hexes, enchantments, as well as clay pictures, what we call voodoo dolls today, designed to cause harm to individuals or their livestock. This potentially made the witch a very powerful figure within the cultural dynamics of the 1600s.
This is the churchyard in the historic village of Gisborne, which used to be the home in the early 1600s of Jeanette Preston. The only thing left to remind us of Jeanette Preston is the lonely plaque in the churchyard. Now, Jeanette's story can be seen as a microcosm of what happened to the Pendle witches as a whole. But this was also the home of the powerful Lister family, whose family seat was in nearby Westby Hall. And trouble began for Jeanette with the death of Thomas Lister, the lord of the manor.
Prior to the creation of the High Court system, an assize was a court that formally sat at intervals, usually during the summer months, in each county of England and Wales, so as to administer the civil and criminal law of the time. Generally, the judges and magistrates who took part in these courts were highly prejudiced against the locals, particularly if they were of poor or marginalised groups, and showed very little mercy or compassion when dealing out what was then considered to be justice.
Now, at Jeanette's trial at the York Assizes, it was said that on his deathbed, Thomas Lister cried out in great extremity against Jeanette, saying, "Keep hold of her, she's in the house, don't let her escape away." And so he died. A witness at the trial, Anne Robinson, also said that Lister cried out, "Preston's wife lays heavy upon me, don't let her escape." After the trial, Thomas Potts, who recorded the original transcript, said that Jeanette had full use of the manor house. So what was the relationship between Thomas Lister and Jeanette Preston?
In the 1600s, any relationship between the patriarch of an establishment, landed gentry or well-to-do family, with that of a woman, particularly a younger woman, was always seen to be nefarious in nature. By default, such a person was considered a gold digger who had weaseled their way into the family with the intention of stealing the wealth. Among the jealous peasantry, and especially among the family involved, this nefarious relationship, regardless of it being true or not, was generally attributed to something along the lines of witchcraft just as much as sexual seduction. And therefore, charges of witchcraft, bewitching, bedazzlement, and glamouring of these elderly establishment patriarchs by poor peasant girls or lowly women within the social order often met with a charge of witchcraft.
After his death, Thomas Lister's son, another Thomas Lister, found that there was losses in the estate. So he claimed that loss in chattels by witchcraft had been done against him. But strangely enough, it was not this that Jeanette was tried for.
The crime of murder by witchcraft, for which Preston had been accused, was the murder of a son of a local neighbour in Gisborne, although no records remain of who this individual or the child actually was, serving to illustrate how very rare prosecutions of accusations of witchcraft, even concerning emotionally intense scenarios such as surrounding that of the murder of a child, was still not a certainty in terms of a witch ending up on the gallows. Up until 1612, acquittal, once the witch had no political affiliations, such as connections to the Jesuits and so on, was the de facto verdict.
But on returning to Gisborne, she must have noticed the Lister neck closing in, and the balance of power was definitely far on her side. So the inequity of power can best be seen inside this wonderful old church, which would have been here 500 years before Jeanette Preston. But inside here you can see the Lister family chapel, showing the very power that Jeanette was against.
The term witch is rooted in the Low Germanic Old English term of viken or vika, denoting generally a woman who practices ceremonial magic, and by the 1500s a belief arose that such women had personal dealings with the devil and other evil spirits. Interestingly enough, ceremonial magic, cunning folk and witchcraft up until the reign of Elizabeth was generally tolerated on the whole as a somewhat harmless backward superstition still practiced by mainly rural Catholics. And at the time in England, a witch was often referred to as being a Hecate, based on the powerful Greco-Roman pagan goddess Hecate, who represented, amongst other things, the night, magic, witchcraft, the moon, and especially knowledge of herbalism, necromancy, and defense from curses, demonstrating the constant neuroses surrounding the remnants of the old pagan religions among the Protestant establishment of the era, who also saw Catholicism as a vehicle for keeping these old pagan faiths alive. It represented a constant neuroses surrounding such magical arts being practiced among the rural fringes in places such as around Pendle Hill, and this neuroses existed ever present within the increasingly puritanical Protestant establishment, especially so when such conjurations were being practiced among communities who also happened to remain Catholic and potentially had the ability to use these powers to not only summon the devil, but also to overthrow the king and hold England to ransom. Even within the most isolated communities and insular lives of the everyday people who reside within the forgotten and neglected location, very little happens without the residents within such hinterlands escaping the impact of the larger and more complex world outside. The laws, the codes, and prevailing orthodoxy and conventions of the world beyond their own material and psychological boundaries will eventually come looking for them. This is the nature of power systems and bureaucratic institutions. The old adage of someone not being interested in the law, but the law being very much interested in them. In time, the order of the day will eventually oppose itself upon such marginalized, forgotten places. While for the most part such locations and the people who live within these worlds exist as something of a parallel society in tandem with the mainstream social order, they will nonetheless find themselves being imposed upon by the orthodoxy of their time. If the vacuum is not filled by the laws of the land, specific efforts will be undertaken in order to bring these communities into the fold.
So how did the story of the Pendle Witches begin? What was the initial episode that triggered this story, which has stretched over 400 years? On March 18, 1612, when a young girl called Alizon Devise was making her way through Trolden Forest from the town of Trolden to Combe. Now Alizon was a young beggar girl, which her outward appearance would well have shown, particularly to John Law, the peddler who was approaching along the forest path. Now, seeing an opportunity, Alizon went over to John and begged him some pins. And when John rejected her, she became angry and shouted out curses to him. And at this point, John collapsed to the floor. But what this would have appeared to Alizon is that her witchcraft had come true, which just shows to us, isn't it, that against all appearances, witchcraft does actually happen. The curse was there, the intent was there, and the outcome, John collapsed.
While it may seem absurd to people today, concepts of witchcraft and magic, the early 1600s was a very different world than what we know now. It was a dark, austere time where goblins existed behind every tree line, where every potential cunning folk had the ability to destroy one's livestock, coming home to a witch mark on the gatepost to your house or farm. And the fact is that these fears, these phobias, weren't necessarily irrational, brought out of superstition. The most educated people of the time had a deep and profound belief that witchcraft and magic was real as a fact of life. And this fact was born out of not merely superstitions or prejudice, but you may come home one day and find a witch mark on the gate to your farm, and all your livestock suddenly become very sick, and your yields of your crops don't produce, while the farms on either side of you, their crop yields are normal and their livestock are fine. And what's this telling you? It's telling you that magic works, just like magic worked when Alizon hexed John Law on his way from Halifax and he fell down. People lived in fear of magic. They lived in fear of hexes for the simple reason that the magic worked. While on the surface, Alizon asking John Law to give her some handmade metal pins free of charge may seem benign, the reason for her desire for acquiring these pins was due to Alizon being the granddaughter of the notorious local witch named Demdike, and these pins were needed for numerous magical purpose, in particular the stabbing of clay likenesses of individuals similar in purpose and design. Essentially, this was black magic in its purest form. And Alizon's frustration, coupled with her fear of returning back home to her family without these pins, demonstrates that at some level she was extremely uncomfortable with being a part of any form of sorcery beyond that of herbalism and cures.
So they took John to an inn in Colne to rest and recover from his illness. And then it was on March the 29th that Alizon arrived to meet Abraham, John's son, and to see how John was getting on, to visit him. But she showed so much regret. She begged John for forgiveness, which he freely gave. Unfortunately, Abraham was having none of this, and he reported the incident to Henry Hargreaves, the local constable, who interviewed Alizon and then handed it on to Roger Noel. Alizon appeared to be so overwhelmed by the relative sophistication of Roger Noel, or the opulence of his huge manor house, Reed Hall, that she was so open to answering the questions that by the end of the interview, she'd implicated members of her own family and another local family, the Whittles, another family that were known for their witchcraft.
As a result of being glamoured and bedazzled by the ambitious magistrate, Alizon's grandmother, Elizabeth Southrons, aka Demdike, and Anne Whittle, also known as Chattox, as well as Anne Redfern, were all brought before Noel for questioning on the 2nd of March. The two elderly matriarchs either didn't understand the dangers of what they were in, or didn't care, as they both spoke openly of having given their souls to the devil decades ago, practically to the point of boasting. Even Noel himself must have been taken aback by their candid behaviour. To this day, historians and other commentators have been at a loss to explain why these two elderly women were literally to the point of willingly sacrificing themselves to the gallows with their loose lips and culpability of their own magical practices. Again, we can't rule out the possibility of them hoping the court would be less harsh on them if they were open and forthcoming about their sorceries. And this does sound like an attempt to curry favour. After all, many people have been charged with witchcraft under Elizabeth I's Act Against Conjurations, Enchantments and Witchcrafts had been acquitted, so there was some, if not highly risky, logic in their approach. However, A split was also taking place within the overall group dynamic, possibly cultivated by Noel himself, in which Anne Redfern was not so forthcoming as to provide such a confession of witchcraft. Seemingly, she was the only one of the Pendle witches who understood that magic is ultimately a secretive art in which details of the sorceries and conjurations must never be spoken aloud to anyone who is not party to the initial ceremony and rites. However, her silence and attempts at defense became increasingly futile, as the others spoke freely of her making clay figures to cause sickness upon others. The dark clouds above Pendle Hill were now only growing darker, and Anne Redfern alone understood this more than the rest of the accused Pendle witches. The evidence heard by Roger Nowell was so overwhelmingly complex and utterly convincing that he ordered the four accused, Demdike, Chattox and Redfern, Alizon, to be sent off to Lancaster Castle. There they were to be held until the August Assizes, where they would be tried for maleficarum, or causing harm by witchcraft. Being ever the ambitious and cunning magistrate who bamboozled Alizon Devices into her de facto confession at Reed Hall, it was obvious that her knowledge and ability of the secret arts and folkish blasphemies were clearly not innate within her. It was clear that she had been schooled in her abilities as a witch, and now Roger Nowell was now very much on the hunt, so to speak. From one solitary young woman using witchcraft upon an innocent stranger, the situation was now one of a full-blown witch hunt, under the brooding and meandering shadows of Pendle Hill. Fear and loathing soon gripped the landscape.
So the outcome of all this is that on March the 30th, 1612, she and her grandmother, the infamous Demdike, Anne Whittle, also known as Chattox, and her daughter Anne Redfern, started the long journey to Lancaster Castle, where they were to be held on various charges of witchcraft.
Both Roger Nowell and the establishment as a whole showed no pity towards the advancing years of both Demdike and Chattox. Both were seen as the heads of two snakes filled with the same venom. As a result, the rest of the members of the Sudrons and Whittles families would be easier to break by virtue of their respective leadership's absence. What is especially remarkable about these two women is that despite their poverty and overall appalling quality of life, they had both managed to survive almost 3 times longer than the average lifespan for the era. In the 1600s, the average lifespan was 35 years of age. This would have been even lower for women due to high mortality rates during childbirth. However, both Elizabeth Sudrons and Anne Whittle had managed to survive into their 80s, and this appears almost supernatural in and of itself, as if to suggest something other than their biological functioning alone had kept them alive for so long. The harvesting of a life force or psychic energy of others as part of their enchantments and sorceries cannot be ruled out. Of course, we can't separate the issue of religious tension at the early part of the 1600s, particularly in the aftermath of the Gunpowder Plot and the arrest of the main plotters such as Guy Fawkes. There was a belief that Catholicism and witchcraft were one of the same thing. Many of the implements used in the Catholic High Mass, the bells, the candles, and so on, were seen as being also instrumental to the witches or the sorcerer's table. And things such as the transubstantiation of the Catholic High Mass, absolutely seen as witchcraft in the eyes of the Church of England. And it was very easy to fuse the concept of witchcraft and Roman Catholicism together. And this allowed a situation where 2 birds could be killed with 1 stone. Along with the acceptance of the cunning folk as healers and herbal witches, the other aspect of their existence, involving curses and hexes, created an element of respect and fear within the overall culture in places such as Pendle Hill. The result of this is that when it suited them, the authorities found it easy to level accusations and verdicts of witchcraft among such people, as they would have already had a reputation of being dangerous within the community, such as Preston's previous conviction, for which he was acquitted, for killing the son of a neighbour by means of witchcraft. Witnesses needed to testify against such workers of the magical arts were generally not difficult to come by in a community where decades or even centuries of real grievances could be held by families, and where petty jealousies could be weaponized into full-blown mass hysteria, especially from the late Elizabethan period on, when these witch crazes became more and more common as the Protestant Reformation took root in Central and Northern Europe. When accusations of witchcraft in tandem with one's personal religious affiliations were being investigated, such as the cunning folk or the witch being Catholic, then these events took on a life of their own, sometimes with truly devastating consequences.
The journey over from Pendle to Lancaster would have taken our group over some of the most remote and wild landscapes of Lancashire, including the Trough of Bowland we see behind us. That's a massive wide open moorland, and for the first time they would have looked over Morecambe Bay and seen the sea. Would this excitement of seeing this spectacle for the first time, would it have excited them, or would it have just have washed away with the emotion of the whole of the events? First night would have been spent here in Clitheroe Castle, down in the dungeons, not a welcoming prospect. And the following morning they would have been off north towards Lancaster over the Trough of Bowland.
In tandem with the death of Rudolph II of Bohemia, that diametrically King James of England was himself determined to destroy all manner of witchcraft and sorceries within his own realm, England or Scotland. Only the pillory and the gallows. Both witches and Catholics were to be rooted out of their nests and strongholds. The northern English county of Lancashire was soon to become centre stage in this battle between the king and against what was considered a papist witch alliance. Lancashire was one of the last great holdouts of Catholicism within post-Reformation England.
Over the other side of Morecambe Bay, they would have seen Lancaster again for the first time. Now, would they have realised that this place that was going to seal their fate for good or for evil? Would they have realised that when they arrived that they would be shackled to one central ring cemented into the floor in a cold, dark, damp cell? But one thing they did find when they arrived there was that Elizabeth wasn't going to see her mother again, and James wasn't going to see his grandmother, because old Mother Demdike wasn't fit for the circumstances. She'd passed away. So after a gruelling moorland journey, our accused from Pendle found their fate here at Lancaster Castle. Old Demdike, having survived the journey, was locked up in the cold cell with the rest of the accused. Ironically, Demdike, as she died in the cold dark cell, a merciful release. So the rest and incarnation of Alizon, Demdike, Chattox and Redfern caused a lot of rumble in the Pendle area. And as a result, a meeting was called at Malkin Tower, the home of the Demdike family. Now, while thinking of Malkin Tower, don't think of a huge opulent place like the name suggests. This would have been a very small, very meagre stone structure. Now, it's been long demolished, but it would have been just on the hillside just here, and overlooked by Pendle Hill in the background there. So over here is the old path from Gisborne, where Jeanette Preston would have come up to the meeting on her old pony. The meeting took place on Good Friday, and this was 6th of April. And according to James Devive, the brother of Alizon, the meeting had 3 points on the agenda. Firstly, strangely, the idea was to blow up Lancaster's castle and to free 3 accused. Now, this may not sound quite as strange when you remember that it was only 6 years since they conspired a plot. So the second item on the agenda was to help Jeanette to be freed from the clutches of Thomas Lister Jr., hopefully by gathering their powers together. And the third item of finding a familiar for Alizon. Now, this would have been a spirit in the form of an animal that would have helped her in time of need. Now, of course, we don't know what happened at meeting, no minutes to refer to. But James Device told that after the meeting, all the witches went out of their house in their shapes and likenesses, and Preston's wife was the last. And when she got out onto horseback, they all vanished out of sight.
The King James himself had been greatly influenced by the horrific persecution of witches, and entire communities accused of witchcraft in both Scandinavia and in particular Denmark. When he arrived back to England, believing that his passage along the way across the sea had been hexed by witches, his fanatical hatred of witches only grew stronger, to the point where he even attended in person brutal tortures and forced confessions of suspected witches.
So when the news of the meeting at Malcolm Tower came out, Roger Noel became involved again. Mr. Noel was the local magistrate, but he was also a career politician. And it was only a couple of years ago, in 1610, that he'd been raised to the lofty heights of High Sheriff of Lancashire. So a very powerful gentleman indeed.
In the post-pagan era, folk traditions and spiritual welfare of the peasantry wasn't exclusively overseen by the prevailing Christian churches. There was a large grey area between that of the old and the new faiths, whereby a kind of social compromise took root. A world of wise women, necromancers, soothsayers, and other spiritual refugees from the pagan past who called upon nature spirits and other non-material beings for help and healing. In time, these would all become known as the cunning folk within England as a whole. In many ways, the last survivors of a tradition that not only went back as far as the Druids of the Celtic world, but perhaps far, far further back again into a proto-shamanic culture which built the stone monuments and ringed enclosures of the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods. The cunning folk were also known as conjurers, or more simply as knowing or wise folk. From the Middle Ages and well into the era of the Cromwellian English Civil War period, these conjurers were a class of social witches and folk healers who were so deeply entrenched within English society to a degree that they were something of a powerful, cohesive, complementary spiritual system for the English people at the time. So much so that the cunning folk were essentially capable of undermining the power of the Protestant bishops in particular. However, during the time of Catholic England, they were generally tolerated and considered something of a social safety valve at a time when people had very little other help from the churches or governments. A lot of this pre-Elizabethan leniency towards the cunning folk was due to the fact that they generally operated on an individual basis, and more importantly, there was no formal organised structure surrounding their presence within English society to any great degree so as to threaten the power of the church or that of the government. Following the implementation of the first English Witchcraft Act during the Elizabethan period, the cunning folk were generally from that point on practicing Catholics, and for the most part saw no contradiction between the Church of Rome and their own magical and spiritual indulgences. In general, the Catholic clergy had an unofficial policy of accepting this arrangement, as no spiritual or political threats were seen emanating from these folk healers. Well, not to the point where good Catholics were no longer attending Mass or celebrating high holy feast days. Live and let live being somewhat the de facto arrangement from the time of the Synod of Whitby in 664 and right up to the Act of Supremacy in 1534, signifying the break from the Catholic Church and thereby making the King or Queen of England the supreme head of the new Protestant Church of England.
So he arrested a few from the meeting, took them to Reed Hall for questioning, and as a result, 7 of those were arrested on trials of of accusations of witchcraft and sent off to the various assizes. Jeanette Preston to York, because she was from Gisborne, and Gisborne was in Yorkshire then, and the others to Lancaster Castle. So the 7 that were sent to Lancaster were Elizabeth and James Devise, so part of the Demdikes and Alizon family, Alice Nutter, Catherine Hewitt, Alice Gray, John and Janet Bullock. A 30-mile journey across from Pendle to Lancaster would have been arduous and over heavy moorland. So what must they have been thinking? They must be worried about what was going to happen to them.
They would have also wondered if they would stand in the shadow of Pendle Hill ever again. They would have known, deep down inside the dry stone wall paths they walked along, their way to Lancaster, were probably akin to their own funeral procession. Not only to be taunted and mocked by the people they would have encountered along the way, but to be also aware that pity and compassion for their plight was vanishing into the distance along with their last sight of Pendle Hill.
All of the defendants were charged of various acts of murder by witchcraft, apart from Alizon Devise, of course, who was charged with the laming of the peddler, John Law. You remember the thing that started this whole thing off right at the beginning? Much of the evidence gathered by Roger Noel before the trial came from this area, New Church in Pendle, on Rough Lee, where Alice Nutter here came from. Now, examples are, James told of how 12 years earlier, Chattox had been to the church in New Church, taken 8 teeth from a skull there and give them to Demdike for magical purposes. Now, Demdike had also admitted to being a witch for 20 years after meeting the devil in the shape of a boy in New Church. And then 6 years later, she met a spirit by the name of Sid, who came in the shape of a dog. And this sent her insane for 8 weeks. James also told how a spirit called Dandy came to him in the shape of a black dog. At the trial, James appeared, according to Thomas Potts, insensible in all things, but that he could neither stand, hear, nor speak. And another thing about James Devise is that he had stolen a sheep from a nearby neighbour that was to be sacrificed at Malkin Tower on Good Friday. The Lamb of God, maybe. Another anomaly at the trial was Alice Nutter, and this is the statue of her in Rough Lee, Pendle, where she lived. Now, Alice, unlike the others, a very well-to-do family, and the others were just scratching for a living day by day. Alice was the only one of the group who refused to speak during the questioning or even at the trial. So who or what was she protecting with her silence about her activities on this Good Friday? The Nutter family were part of the Pendle Forest Catholic stronghold in a time when this was a very dangerous thing to be. 2 of the Nutter family had actually been executed for being Jesuit priests in 1584 and 1600, just 12 years previous. Lancaster Castle would have been here since at least the 11th century. Until about a decade ago, it was still a working prison. And of course, it was the final destination for our accused group from Pendle. They would have found the look of this building terrifying. They were to spend 4 months around in the cells here, awaiting the assizes in summer of 1612. And the court case was to be held between the 17th and the 19th of August by the learned judges Bromley and Eltham. Also in the court was Roger Noel for the prosecution. And for the defence, well, nobody. So the trial was over. And it was just up to the Justice Edward Bromley to read out the verdicts and the sentences. First up was Chattox. She'd been charged with the killing of Robert Greenhead by witchcraft. She was found guilty. Sentence: death by hanging. Elizabeth Devise was up next. She was charged with the killing of John Robertson, James Robertson, and Henry Mytton by witchcraft. Now, the main witness against Elizabeth was her 9-year-old daughter, Janet. And when she stood up to give evidence, Elizabeth couldn't stand it. She shouted in panic for Janet to stop, so much that she was removed from the court. Janet was then placed on a table, and she gave damning evidence against her own mother that led her to the gallows. Elizabeth was found guilty. The verdict: death by hanging. Next up was James Devise. He'd been charged with the killing of Anne Townley of Cor Hall and James Duckworth of the Lound. Now, he'd been unable to speak nor stand during the trial because of the conditions in the cells. But still he was found guilty. Sentence: death by hanging. And then Anne Redfern. She'd been charged with the killing of Roger Nutter by witchcraft. Well, there wasn't enough evidence, and she was found not guilty. Well, then she was charged with the killing of Christopher Nutter by witchcraft. For this she was found guilty. The sentence: death by hanging. And then Alice Nutter. Now, she'd been quiet, hadn't spoken, given evidence either before the trial or during the trial. But she was charged with the killing of Henry Mytton. Just the same as Elizabeth Devise, so they must have worked together, apparently. Anyway, for this she was found guilty, and the sentence was death by hanging. Catherine Hewitt, she was charged with the killing of Anne Folds by witchcraft, again found guilty, and again death by hanging. And then we had Jane Bullock and her son John, charged with the killing of John Dean of Newfield Edge. Again, she was found guilty, and the sentence was death by hanging. Alice Gray was charged with killing Jean Dean by witchcraft, but she was found not guilty, and she's the only one that acquitted. And then we have Alizon Devise. She was charged with the laming of John Law, right at the beginning of the whole story. She was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. So on Thursday the 20th of August, the 9 were led just over a mile to Golgotha village, where they were to climb Gallows Hill, to be hanged by the neck until they were dead. Now, it's a widely held belief that anyone who was convicted at Lancaster Castle and sent up to Gallows Hill to be sentenced and hung would have the chance of a last drink. And that last drink would be here at the Golden Lion in Lancaster. The building would have changed much since the 1600s, but it's the same pub and it's on the same piece of land. There's actually a plaque on the side of the wall here in remembrance at the time that the witches are allegedly here to have their last drink before ending their lives on Gallows Hill. The use by Roger Noel of the younger members of the Devise family, James and Janet, to implicate the others is quite sinister and wouldn't have been allowed today. For James in particular, medical and psychiatric reports would have had to be done, and he would probably have been deemed unfit for trial. So what was going through James's mind? Well, we can only guess at this. Was he seduced by the wealth and the opulence of Roger Nowell and Reed Hall, or was he just trying to please this seemingly important person with his damning evidence? Or did he believe his stories of strange magical practices carried out by his family and the Demdike family? Either way, it's clear that Nowell must have realised that James was his ticket to success here. The evidence given by James before the trial, together with that of Janet during the trial, were fundamental in condemning them all. Today we may struggle to see into the mind of James, into his head, what he was thinking, but it's clear that Roger Nowell could do this all too well. So it's here up on Golgotha Hill that our group finally met their end, because this is where they were hung. How strange that the Ashton Memorial here, this huge folly, should be on the very same site as the hangings took place. Where our group were buried, we don't know. It's supposed to be somewhere around here. But it's been forgotten in time. Janet Preston had suffered the same fate just a month ago in York on the 20th of July. And it was just 4 months since Alizon Devise had encountered John Law in Trodden Forest and begged for pence.
Twixt Burnley and Clitheroe, Whalley and Colne, where Hodder and Ribble's fair waters do meet, with barley and Downham content at thy feet. O Pendle, majestic, sublime, where praise is showing till the end of all time. In beauty eternal thy banner unfurled, thou dearest and grandest old hill in the world. When witches do fly on a cold winter's night, we won't tell a soul and we'll bolt the door tight. We'll sit round the fire and keep ourselves warm, until once again we can walk in your arm. O Pendle, by moorland and fell, in glory and loveliness ever to dwell. Life's faithful journey where we may be, we'll pause in my labours and oft think of thee. Pendle, thou standest alone, Burnley and Clitheroe, Whalley and Colne, where Hodder and Ribble's fair waters do meet, with barley and Downham content at thy feet.
And for all this, the very cultural erosive of the trial and the Pendle witches and all that involved has left its scar in the local area even to this day. Perhaps the greatest effect of witchcraft is the stigma.
All this be known to thee?